I woke up to what should have been an ordinary morning. But the moment I opened my front door, the world felt different. The air was colder, heavier, almost hostile. And there it was, a deep, jagged trench circling my entire property. Freshly dug, precise, deliberate. My quiet street, normally serene, suddenly looked like a battlefield. My home, my safe place, was isolated by raw soil and harsh lines. An unspoken warning written into the earth. Shock pinned me in place. Every detail screamed intention. The edges were sharp. The soil disturbed recently, and the morning light cast long, dramatic shadows across the yard. I felt a mixture of fear and disbelief. How could this have happened overnight without anyone noticing? Was it the HOA? A neighbor? Someone I trusted? I remembered my security cameras, installed months earlier for peace of mind. Reviewing the footage, my stomach sank. Shadows moved deliberately along my property line at night. Flashlights tracing paths. Small markers appearing in silent, calculated patterns. This wasn't random. It was planned. A clear message that someone wanted to assert control and intimidation. A knot of anger and fear twisted inside me. The minor notices, the slow glances from the HOA board, the casual but pointed observations. They weren't mistakes. They were tests, precursors to this very moment. My property, my sanctuary, had become a stage for a silent war I hadn't known I was part of. Yet, amid the shock, determination began to rise. I would not be intimidated. I would document everything, analyze every shadow and mark, and uncover the truth. Whoever orchestrated this would know I was watching. And as I stood there, staring at the trench that now defined the boundary of my world, one thought cut through all the fear. This was only the beginning. Before the chaos, mornings were peaceful. Sunlight spilled gently across the lawns. Sprinklers glinting like scattered diamonds. Birds chirped overhead, and the distant sound of neighbors walking their dogs or chatting filled the quiet streets. I sat on my porch, coffee in hand, feeling the warmth seep into my palms. Life seemed simple, predictable, calm. My home wasn't extravagant, but it was mine. A place of routine and comfort. Evenings had the soft glow of porch lights and the gentle hum of sprinklers. Mornings held the aroma of fresh coffee and the promise of quiet reflection. From the outside, the street looked perfect. Tidy lawns, neat sidewalks, identical houses lined in symmetry. It was the kind of neighborhood that made people slow down while driving, admiring its order without realizing the subtle pressures that kept it that way. The HOA existed mostly in the background then. Notices arrived occasionally, polite reminders about lawn heights, trash bin placements, mailbox aesthetics. I barely paid attention, assuming rules were harmless. A structure keeping the community presentable. But tiny moments began to hint that this calm was fragile. A board member driving past my house, his eyes lingering on my property. A newsletter subtly stressing uniformity and compliance. Conversations with neighbors that ended awkwardly, words carefully chosen as if someone might be listening. I dismissed the unease at first. Life was busy. Work, errands, routines. These were minor quirks, small reminders that perfection had a price. But the faint tension persisted, like a low hum under a calm melody. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it lingered in my awareness. Little things, a misplaced trash can, slightly longer grass, casual glances, all felt watched, measured and evaluated. That morning, sipping my coffee, I couldn't have imagined how those minor irritations would evolve. The neighborhood's serene facade masked something more insidious. Rules enforced selectively, scrutiny that was personal, an unspoken game of control. What seemed like calm order would soon erupt into a full-blown confrontation, stretching boundaries far beyond trivial complaints. At that moment, I felt secure, unaware that my life was about to change. The routine, the quiet streets, the neighborly smiles, all were part of a stage. And though the morning felt safe, the first seeds of conflict had already been planted. Soon I would understand that in this neighborhood, appearances were deceptive, and every small act of compliance or defiance would be scrutinized. By the time the coffee was finished, a subtle tension had taken root. The calm was temporary. The HOA's gaze was already on me, even if I didn't yet see the full extent. That perfect morning would soon be overshadowed by notices, intrusions, and escalating conflicts. But for now, the sun rose gently, and life seemed peaceful. The quiet before the storm. Even as life seemed normal, subtle cracks in the facade began to appear. That afternoon, I noticed board member 1 driving slowly past my house again. His black sedan gliding down the street at a pace that wasn't casual. His eyes scanned my property as though memorizing every detail and the angle of my mailbox, the alignment of flower beds, the way my porch furniture caught the sun. At first, I dismissed it as coincidence. Perhaps he was lost, or maybe he was simply inspecting the neighborhood, as board members often do. But it wasn't the first time. Over the past few weeks, I had caught glances of him during quiet moments, turning his car just so to look at my lawn, pausing at my driveway for seconds that felt too long, a subtle frown flickering across his face. Even the neighbors seemed aware, exchanging quick, meaningful looks whenever he passed by. The signs were faint, almost imperceptible, but the instinct to feel watched is hard to ignore. The neighborhood, once serene, now carried a subtle tension that made my movements feel measured. Even watering the plants in my front yard felt like a public performance. I glanced over my shoulder more than usual, catching shadows that seemed too precise to be random, feeling the weight of silent observation. Each day, the calm became slightly more fragile, like a glass teetering on the edge of a table. That evening, the HOA newsletter arrived in the mail. The language was subtle, polite, yet insidious. Terms like compliance and community standards appeared repeatedly, nestled among reminders about mailbox placement and shrub trimming. It almost seemed harmless until I realized the emphasis on uniformity wasn't a general guideline. It was a pointed warning. Subconsciously, I understood that someone had started measuring me against these standards more carefully than any other resident. The small glances, the calculated driving, the subtle messaging began to weave together in a pattern I couldn't ignore. Life was no longer just routine. It had begun to feel orchestrated, as though each step I took was under silent evaluation. The very streets that once felt comforting now carried an undertone of suspicion, subtle tension vibrating through the air. Even though nothing overt had happened yet, I felt the first pangs of unease settle in my chest. It was not fear alone, nor just curiosity. It was the prelude to conflict. The careful, almost invisible, ways in which the HOA and its board members were asserting control became my first true glimpse of the storm to come. By the time the sun set that day, the seed of anxiety had taken root, and I realized that my peaceful life on the porch was already being quietly measured, judged, and prepared for disruption. The calm had ended, and the first moves in this subtle battle had begun. It began quietly, almost innocuously. One morning, as I stepped onto the porch, my eyes caught a crisp white envelope taped to the front door. The familiar bold letters at the top read, "Violation Notice." My heart skipped a beat. I tore it open, expecting a minor formatting error, a trivial complaint, perhaps even a mistake. What I didn't expect was the cold precision of the message inside. According to the notice, my trash bin had been left, visible from the street for an extended period. I paused, glancing at the neatly lined bin I had placed out only 30 minutes before pickup, exactly as the neighbors did every week. None of them had received a notice. None had been singled out. The phrasing was formal, almost clinical, yet the undercurrent of accusation was unmistakable. Initially, I told myself it was an oversight. Mistakes happen. Perhaps a board member had misread the timing or misidentified the house. I placed the notice aside, telling myself not to overreact. But as the week progressed, I noticed subtle signs that told a different story. The same board member who had been observing my home now seemed increasingly attentive, sometimes lingering at the end of my driveway in a way that felt intentional. His car idled for long seconds as if measuring something invisible. Then came the next notice, this time targeting a small patch of my lawn. A corner near the driveway, slightly lighter in color due to the summer sun. The HOA labeled it neglected landscaping, attaching a formal warning. I looked around and saw that half the neighborhood had lawns equally stressed by heat, yet no one else received a warning. It became clear I wasn't being observed randomly. I was being singled out, scrutinized, tested. I tried to comply, adjusting the sprinklers, moving the trash bin at precise times, keeping every detail perfect. I remained patient, calm, cooperative. Yet the notices persisted, escalating in both frequency and absurdity. My porch decor, mailbox condition, even the angle of my car parked in the driveway became subject to formal complaints. The messages were polite, formatted correctly, but the intent was unmistakable. Intimidation through relentless scrutiny. The cumulative effect began to weigh on me. The tiny cracks of unease that had crept into my mornings now widened into anxiety. Every step outside my door, every casual glance at the sidewalk, carried the weight of potential judgment. Life in this neighborhood, once serene and predictable, now felt like a chessboard, and I had become the target piece. By the time the evening sun dipped below the rooftops, I knew one thing for certain. This was no longer about rules or aesthetics. This was a carefully orchestrated campaign, and I was at the center. The question that haunted me that night was simple yet terrifying. How far were they willing to go, and what would come next? That night, something felt off before anything even happened. It was the kind of unease you can't explain. A tightening in the air, a heaviness that settles over a house when silence stops. Feeling peaceful and starts feeling alert. I had just turned off the living room lights when a faint metallic sound drifted in from the side yard. A scrape, then a short tap. Too deliberate to be an animal, too rhythmic to be the wind. My heartbeat quickened as I walked slowly toward the window, careful not to make noise. I pulled the curtain back just enough to see outside, and my breath caught in my throat. Two figures moved along the fence line, flashlights sweeping low across the ground as if searching for something specific. Their steps were slow, calculated, synchronized. These weren't random trespassers. They were surveying, inspecting, measuring. The light from the flashlights cast long shadows that stretched across the grass, making the scene look even more surreal. I couldn't see their faces, but their postures were confident, purposeful. They knew exactly what they were doing and exactly where they needed to be. For a moment, I froze, unsure whether to confront them or stay hidden. I leaned closer to the window, and the cold realization hit me. They were not near the house. They were at the perimeter, walking the exact boundary line of my property. They paused occasionally, shining their lights on small markers in the soil, the same kind of markings I had found earlier that week. Everything connected in an instant. These weren't vandals or late-night workers. Someone had sent them. And the only group with that kind of access, authority, and hidden agenda was the HOA. My fear twisted into something else, a sharp blend of anger and determination. I reached for my phone and quietly opened the security camera feed. The infrared view captured the figures clearly enough to confirm what I already suspected. This was planned. This was coordinated, and it was happening under the cover of darkness because they didn't want to be seen. Before I could record more, the two figures abruptly stopped, exchanged a brief signal, and retreated toward the street, disappearing as quickly and as quietly as they had appeared. No word spoken, no explanation left behind, just the lingering echo of their intrusion. I stood there long after they left, staring into the night, the cold glass of the window pressed against my fingertips. The message was unmistakable. The daytime notices and petty warnings had been just the beginning. Now they were stepping onto my property, inspecting it, planning something bigger, something they didn't want documented. And in that moment, one thought refused to leave my mind. If this is what they're willing to do at night, what are they preparing for next? I woke up the next morning feeling the weight of the previous night still sitting on my chest. I barely slept, replaying the shadows, the flashlights, the quiet footsteps moving along the edge of my property. A part of me hoped that when the sun came up, everything would make more sense, that maybe the darkness had exaggerated the threat. But the moment I stepped outside, all hope disappeared. I stopped dead in my tracks. My jaw went slack. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing at first. It looked unreal, like something torn straight from a nightmare. Because there, surrounding my entire house, was a trench. A deep, raw, freshly carved trench, circling the property like a boundary someone had, violently redrawn during the night. The soil was still loose, piled in uneven mounds. The edges were jagged, the cuts too precise to be accidental. This wasn't the result of workers fixing a pipe or repairing a utility line. This was intentional, deliberate, planned. My hands instinctively went to my head as I tried to understand how something this massive could happen without my knowledge, without anyone informing me, without a single warning. The neighborhood was silent, almost unnaturally so, as if the houses themselves were watching me react. I slowly walked along the edge of the trench, feeling a tightness in my chest as the reality set in. Someone had dug around my entire property while I slept. Someone had come onto my land, used heavy equipment, and carved out the earth with absolute confidence that no one would stop them. I knelt beside the fresh soil and noticed something that sent another chill down. My spine. Small survey flags, each one placed with precision. Red, yellow, and white markers lined the perimeter, identical to the ones used during HOA-mandated corrections in past neighborhood disputes. I had seen these flags before, but never on my property. My mind raced back to the figures from last night, the silent measurements, the flashlight scanning the ground, the quick retreat once they had gathered whatever information they needed. It all made sense now. Last night wasn't a random inspection, it was preparation. Someone wanted this trench here. Someone authorized it. Someone executed it under the cover of darkness. Neighbors peeked from windows, curtains moving ever so slightly. No one came outside. No one asked questions. No one offered help. They all knew something, or at least suspected it. This wasn't just happening to me, this was something bigger. Something they had seen before, maybe from afar. Something they were too afraid to interfere with. I felt anger boiling beneath the shock. Confusion twisted into disbelief. Disbelief into outrage. What was the HOA planning? Why had they targeted me so intensely? And how could they possibly justify something this extreme? I stepped back and looked at the full circle of destruction, feeling more isolated than ever before. This wasn't just a violation of rules. The day of the board meeting arrived, and I felt a mixture of apprehension and resolve as I stepped into the polished, artificially lit boardroom. The air was thick with tension, the faint scent of coffee and paper blending into the sense of anticipation that seemed to hang over every person present. I carried my laptop like a shield, the accumulated evidence from weeks of surveillance, photographs and notes resting within its hard drive. Every email, every violation notice, every carefully documented intrusion was now about to face scrutiny under the very people who had orchestrated it. The board members sat stiffly around the polished table, the glow of the overhead lights casting sharp shadows on their faces. Board member 1, a man in his late 40s with slicked back hair and a perfectly tailored blazer, regarded me with a mix of skepticism and barely hidden irritation. Beside him, board member 2, wearing glasses and an uneasy expression, fidgeted nervously, his hands twisting the pen in front of him, as if it might offer some shield against the truth about to be revealed. Other residents watched quietly from the perimeter, murmuring among themselves, curiosity and concern flickering across their faces. I set the laptop on the table, opening it carefully so that the screen faced everyone. The first image already loaded, the nighttime footage of the figures moving along the boundary of my property, flashlights scanning the soil and markers clearly visible. The room fell silent, the only sound the soft hum of the projector and the occasional shuffle of papers. I could see the subtle twitch in board member 1's jaw as his eyes met the screen. The carefully constructed veneer of authority he had maintained for weeks began to crack under the weight of undeniable evidence. Board member 1's face tightened with indignation, yet his eyes betrayed a hint of panic. Board member 2 shuffled in his seat, clearly aware that the narrative unfolding was not in their favor. I allowed a moment of silence to linger, letting the weight of the footage sink in. The room seemed to shrink around them, the authority they had wielded so freely now feeling fragile, vulnerable. I could almost see the mental calculations racing behind their eyes, trying to assess damage control, credibility preservation, and personal accountability all at once. For the first time, I wasn't just reacting. I was controlling the narrative, exposing the orchestration, and setting the terms for accountability. As I closed my presentation, the room sat in stunned silence, a potent mixture of shock, embarrassment, and the unspoken acknowledgement that the power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. And in that moment, I realized this confrontation was not just a personal victory. It was a statement, a declaration that manipulation, intimidation, and unchecked authority would not go unchallenged. The question lingered heavy in the room. What would happen next? Now that the truth was finally exposed, as the cursor hovered over the next file on my laptop, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. This wasn't just another angle or another small detail. It was the footage that captured the HOA's involvement so clearly, so unmistakably, that even their most loyal supporters wouldn't be able to deny it. With a steady hand, I clicked play and the screen filled, with the grainy but unmistakably clear image of two figures moving along my property, lying under the cover of darkness. Both men wore the same identifiable jackets I had seen them wearing in the neighborhood countless times. The reflective HOA maintenance vests that no ordinary resident had access to. They carried flashlights, their beams slicing through the night, illuminating the small white stakes they had placed earlier as measurement guides. The footage zoomed in, showing one of them kneeling, pressing the stake into the soil, while the other looked over his shoulder anxiously, as if afraid of being caught. That tiny gesture, that moment of hesitation, said more than words ever could. A wave of low, shocked murmurs spread through the room. Some neighbors leaned forward, squinting to confirm what they were seeing, while others sank back in disbelief. The glow from the video illuminated the board members' faces, revealing every twitch, every tightening muscle, every flicker of panic they tried to suppress. Even through the reflection on the laptop screen, the emotion was palpable. I paused the footage right at the moment one of the men looked directly at the camera. His face was unmistakable. An HOA contractor who had been present at every inspection and had mysteriously shown up around my property more times than I could count. I heard someone behind me whisper, "That's him! That's definitely him." The board members shifted, uncomfortably in their seats, their silence heavier than any denial they could have attempted. I resumed the clip. The men began digging, not a small trench, not an accidental scrape, but a calculated, deliberate cut into my land. Their movements were measured, methodical, almost rehearsed. The audacity of their actions hit everyone in the room. It wasn't just vandalism. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a coordinated operation intended to intimidate and manipulate me into compliance with an accusation that had never been legitimate to begin with. Board member 1 exhaled sharply through his nose, his jaw tightening as if he wanted to interrupt but knew he couldn't. Board member 2 swallowed hard, his glasses slipping down his nose as he leaned closer to the screen, perhaps hoping the details would somehow blur into ambiguity. But there was no ambiguity. The truth was crystal clear, and it was playing out frame by frame before everyone's eyes. I lifted my eyes and looked directly at the board members. "This," I said, keeping my voice steady, "is what was done on my property without permission, without cause, and without any legal justification." The silence hanging in the room, after I closed the laptop, felt heavier than anything that had happened so far. It wasn't the ordinary quiet of a meeting or the awkward pause of a dispute. It was the kind of silence that settles when people realize they've been lied to. The neighbors sat motionless, processing the evidence. The HOA board members looked like they were bracing for impact, an impact they knew was coming. Board member 1 was the first to break. He shifted in his chair, clearing his throat loudly as if he were about to launch into some well-practiced excuse. But nothing came out. Every time he opened his mouth, his eyes flicked toward the neighbors, who were staring at him with thinly veiled anger. He knew any attempt to spin the situation would backfire instantly. Board member 2 adjusted his glasses nervously, his hands trembling just enough for me to notice. He avoided eye contact with everyone. Staring at the table like the grain of the wood might offer him an escape hatch. He had spent weeks acting superior, threatening, pointing out imaginary violations. But now he looked like a child caught cheating on a test. Finally, the HOA president leaned back in his seat, arms crossed tightly across his chest, jaw clenched. His posture screamed defiance, but the flicker in his eyes gave away the truth. He'd lost control. The narrative he'd built, the pressure he'd applied, the intimidation tactics, all shattered in a single meeting. One of the neighbors stood up slowly, his voice trembling with anger. "You told us he was the one breaking rules," he said, pointing toward me. "You said he was causing problems for the entire community." His frustration echoed through the room, fueling the tension. Others nodded, murmuring in agreement. Another neighbor shook her head. "And all this time you were digging into his yard at night? Without permission? Without telling anyone?" The disbelief in her voice was unmistakable. The HOA president's face reddened. He opened his mouth to respond, but his words stumbled. "There were concerns," he muttered, though even he seemed ashamed of how weak it sounded. I kept my voice calm, steady, refusing to let the emotion of the moment overpower the facts. "You didn't investigate concerns," I said. You created them. You manipulated them. And then you crossed onto my property and dug a trench to justify your own accusations. Gasps followed my words. The neighbors weren't just angry anymore. They felt betrayed. They trusted the HOA board to manage the community, not to act like shadow operatives performing midnight operations behind their backs. One neighbor stepped forward. We want answers, all of us. His tone was low, controlled, but there was power behind it. The kind of power only a unified community can produce. The meeting wasn't over. Not even close. But for the first time in weeks, the balance of power shifted completely, and the board felt it. The tension inside the HOA meeting room had reached a breaking point. What began as a quiet, structured gathering had transformed into something completely different, a collective awakening. Neighbors who once sat quietly now stood shoulder to shoulder, their voices intertwining with frustration, disbelief, and a growing determination to hold the board accountable. The board members, who for years operated with unchecked authority, now found themselves cornered by the very people they claimed to represent. One neighbor stepped forward, her voice trembling, not from fear but from anger that had been building for months. We trusted you, she said, staring directly at the HOA president. We thought you were making decisions for the good of the community. But everything we've seen tonight proves the opposite. Her words rippled through the room. Others nodded, their faces tight with emotion. Another neighbor raised a copy of the violation notice he had received weeks earlier, a notice he had always suspected was unfair. If you were willing to dig up his property in the middle of the night, he said, pointing toward me, then how many of our fines were based on lies too? More voices joined in, each carrying years of suppressed frustration. Some expressed outrage over the trench. Others brought up unrelated issues, unexplained fees, selective enforcement, suspicious rule changes. It was as if the dam had finally burst, unleashing everything the community had endured but never dared to question openly. The HOA president tried to regain control. Let's remain respectful, he said, his voice wavering. We can address concerns one at a time. But no one was interested in being pacified anymore. A man from the back of the room spoke up, his voice steady and unshakable. Respect? He repeated. Where was your respect when you sent threatening letters without evidence? When you ignored complaints? When you dug that trench behind our backs? His words hit the board like a hammer. Board member 1 leaned forward, his elbows on the table, rubbing his temples as if the pressure in the room was physically painful. Board member 2 attempted to shuffle paperwork into some kind of order, but his hands shook badly, the pages slipping from his grasp and scattering across the table. They couldn't hide their panic anymore. The veneer of confidence, the polished authority, all of it had cracked. The HOA president tried to respond, but his voice cracked. Let's not make rash decisions, he said. But even he didn't believe his own words. I stepped forward slightly. This isn't rash, I said. This is necessary. The room fell silent again, but this time it wasn't the silence of shock. It was the silence of decision-making. Change was coming, and everyone knew it. The board members looked around the room, realizing they no longer had control. The power now belonged to the people. The morning after the explosive HOA meeting felt different, lighter, warmer, almost unfamiliar. For the first time in months, the neighborhood didn't feel like enemy territory. It felt like a community again. As I stepped outside, the quiet hum of sprinklers and birdsong carried a sense of peace I hadn't realized I missed. The trench was gone, the threats had ended, and the fear that once clung to every doorway and mailbox had finally begun to fade. I hadn't even taken a dozen steps down the sidewalk before a few neighbors approached. The same people who once avoided eye contact, afraid of drawing attention from the HOA, now walked toward me with genuine relief on their faces. One woman, someone who had always kept interactions polite but distant, offered a warm smile. You stood up for all of us yesterday, she said softly. Thank you. Her words caught me off guard more than I expected. For months, I had felt alone, singled out, targeted, made to believe I was the problem. But now hearing her speak, it became clear that no one had been unaffected by the board's tactics. They had all been watching, waiting, hoping someone would challenge the authority that held them in silent fear. Another neighbor, an older gentleman, who rarely spoke more than a quiet "good morning," crossed his arms and nodded. "We needed that meeting," he said firmly. "It's about time someone exposed what was happening." A younger couple, pushing a stroller, joined the group. The woman spoke with conviction. "We always suspected they were abusing their power," she said. "We just didn't know how to confront it. After last night, people feel brave again." The idea that courage was contagious struck me deeply. What had begun as a lonely, confusing struggle had turned into something bigger, a collective stand against the injustice that had been quietly shaping their lives for years. These weren't just neighbors anymore. They were allies, partners in reclaiming the safety and fairness of the place they all called home. One man let out a quiet laugh and shook his head. "They really thought they could dig up your whole yard and get away with it," he said. "Unbelievable." I managed a smile. "They thought they were untouchable," I replied. "But now everyone's watching them." A few people exchanged glances. Then one of them said something that made the entire group pause. "We've been talking," she began carefully. "No fear, no secrecy, no intimidation. Just people talking. People reclaiming their home. People choosing each other instead of giving in to the pressure that once kept them silent." As more residents joined the circle, a warmth settled over the moment, a reminder that community isn't built through rules, restrictions, or quiet obedience. It's built through connection, through honesty, through standing together when it matters most. For the first time in a long time, the neighborhood didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like home again. The morning after the explosive HOA meeting felt different, lighter, warmer, almost unfamiliar. For the first time in months, the neighborhood didn't feel like enemy territory. It felt like a community again. As I stepped outside, the quiet hum of sprinklers and birdsong carried a sense of peace I hadn't realized I missed. The trench was gone, the threats had ended, and the fear that once clung to every doorway and mailbox had finally begun to fade. I hadn't even taken a dozen steps down the sidewalk before a few neighbors approached. The same people who once avoided eye contact, afraid of drawing attention from the HOA, now walked toward me with genuine relief on their faces. One woman, someone who had always kept interactions polite but distant, offered a warm smile. "You stood up for all of us yesterday," she said softly. "Thank you." Her words caught me off guard more than I expected. For months, I had felt alone, singled out, targeted, made to believe I was the problem. But now, hearing her speak, it became clear that no one had been unaffected by the board's tactics. They had all been watching, waiting, hoping someone would challenge the authority that held them in silent fear. Another neighbor, an older gentleman, who rarely spoke more than a quiet "good morning," crossed his arms and nodded. "We needed that meeting," he said firmly. "It's about time someone exposed what was happening." A younger couple, pushing a stroller, joined the group. The woman spoke with conviction. "We always suspected they were abusing their power," she said. "We just didn't know how to confront it. After last night, people feel brave again. A committee, a unified voice separate from the board, a way for residents to protect one another, gather information, and prevent abuse from creeping back into the neighborhood. It wouldn't replace the HOA, but it would finally give people a sense of control." I exhaled slowly. "If it helps protect the community," I said, "I'm in." Smiles spread across the group. A few more neighbors, overhearing the conversation, drifted over. They offered support, shared stories, vowed to participate. The unity that had been missing for so long was beginning to take shape in real time, right there on the sidewalk. No fear, no secrecy, no intimidation. Just people talking, people reclaiming their home, people choosing each other instead of giving in to the pressure that once kept them silent. As more residents joined the circle, a warmth settled over the moment, a reminder that community isn't built through rules, restrictions, or quiet obedience. It's built through connection, through honesty, through standing together when it matters most. For the first time in a long time, the neighborhood didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like home again.